At Big Shaq's sister's wedding, a moment of joy turned into a stage of humiliation. When the poor woman was insulted before the glittering crowd, Big Shaq didn't stay silent. In front of all the whispers and fake smiles, Big Shaq stood tall, and what happened next shook every soul under that shining sky. Loyalty, pride, and truth collided, and history was made. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The spring sun stretched lazily across the blue Atlanta sky, painting the city in a golden hue that felt almost too perfect to be real. The O'Neill estate, a sprawling mansion nestled among ancient oak trees and manicured lawns, buzzed with an energy that only a wedding day could summon. From the towering gates to the glittering white tents dotting the yard, every corner spoke of elegance and love, as if the world had paused just to honor Danielle O'Neill's big day. Shaquille O'Neal stood by the grand staircase, adjusting the lapels of his tailored navy blue suit. He wasn't just the towering icon the world knew as Big Shaq today. He was a big brother, a protector, a silent pillar beaming with pride. Danielle had always been the spark in the family, small in stature but mighty in spirit, and now seeing her stepping into a new chapter of life brought a strange sting behind his eyes he hadn't expected. It wasn't sadness, it was something heavier, the bittersweet weight of time passing. Inside the main hall, guests flowed like rivers of bright color. Women in satin gowns, men in sharp suits, children darting between the tables with the innocence only weddings could excuse. The scent of fresh lilies filled the air, blending with the tangy aroma of summer's first barbecue drifting in from the back garden. Everything shimmered with the careful polish of old Southern tradition and new money comfort. Shaq's mother, Lucille O'Neal, presided over the preparations like a queen in her court. Her laughter, deep and infectious, wrapped itself around the guests, smoothing over any wrinkles of nerves. Family, friends, former teammates, neighbors, even a few familiar faces from the city's higher circles. Everyone was here. The guest list was a delicate mixture of prestige and heart, and Shaq could feel the pulse of excitement thrumming beneath every handshake and every clinking glass. Yet amid all the polished surfaces and smiling faces, a subtle tension hovered just beyond reach, like humidity before a storm. Shaq noticed it in the way some guests glanced sidelong at others, judging clothes, judging dates, judging everything. It wasn't outright hostility, but it lingered, the old ugly ghosts of race and class whispering under the breath of polite society. Shaq had lived long enough, fought hard enough to recognize when respect was real, and when it was simply obligation wrapped in thin smile. He shook it off. Today wasn't about the shadows. Today was Danielle's, and Shaq was determined it would be nothing less than perfect. Outside, the wedding garden looked like something out of a dream. Rows of white chairs faced a lattice arch wrapped in roses and baby's breath. The lake behind it caught the sunlight like a mirror, throwing back reflections of the soaring willows and the fluttering ribbons strung from tree to tree. Musicians tuned their instruments under a gazebo, their soft plucking notes riding the breeze. Shaq took a slow walk through the space, his huge frame oddly gentle among the delicate decorations. He smiled at the sight of his nephew's sneaking mini cupcakes behind the catering tent. He offered a playful wink to the photographers who were already angling for the perfect candid shots. He checked in with the event coordinator, a nervy woman juggling a clipboard and a walkie-talkie, assuring her everything was on track. As he walked, guests began filling the chairs, bright dresses and tailored suits blending into a living patchwork quilt. Shaq caught sight of his sister peeking from behind the bridal suite's door, her face glowing beneath the lace of her veil. Their eyes met for a moment across the distance. Danielle's smile, half teasing and half wavering with emotion, hit him like a punch to the gut. This was really happening. The minister, a wiry man with a deep, warm voice, cleared his throat and called for everyone to rise. Music swelled, soft piano layered under the sweet lilt of a violin. Shaq moved to his place beside the groom, steady as a mountain, his heart hammering louder than the orchestra. Then the doors swung open. Danielle stepped into the light, her gown a cascade of shimmering ivory, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. She was radiant, stunning in a way that froze every sound, every breath, every doubt. She walked with a grace that seemed to gather every blessing of the earth and sky into her stride. Shaq's chest tightened. He remembered teaching her to ride a bike, bandaging scraped knees, sneaking her extra Halloween candy behind their mom's back. He remembered the hard days too, the loneliness, the times their family had to grit through, whispered insults and slamming doors. And yet here she was, proof that love could build something beautiful from even the harshest soil. As Danielle moved down the aisle, Shaq glanced around. Most guests watched with misty admiration. But not all. From the corner of his eye he caught little movements, hushed voices, subtle sneers, a few tightly pursed mouths. People who hadn't forgotten where the O'Neills came from, or who couldn't stomach that they stood here now, victorious in ways that money alone couldn't explain. Shaq locked those observations away. Not now. Today was sacred. The ceremony unfolded like a slow, golden wave. Vows were spoken, hands joined, rings exchanged under the blessing of a sun that refused to hide. Shaq found himself blinking back unexpected tears as Danielle and her groom, a sturdy, kind-eyed man named Charles Rivers, sealed their promises with a kiss to the applause of a standing crowd. The reception rolled effortlessly from the ceremony, laughter bubbling like champagne as guests made their way to the long tables draped in linen. Shaq, towering and calm, made sure the staff were treated kindly. The kids had enough room to run, and no one felt small under the grandeur of the occasion. His presence, so often larger than life, today worked like gravity, anchoring everyone gently into the happiness of the moment. And yet, even as plates clattered and glasses chimed, something darker slithered at the edges. An unease coiled in Shaq's gut, warning him that not every smile was sincere, not every cheer was clean. He didn't know yet what form the trouble would take, but he knew one thing for certain. Before this golden day was done, something would test everything he believed in, and he would have to choose comfort or courage. Clara James arrived with a tentative smile and a heart full of hope, her simple cream dress fluttering slightly in the spring breeze as she stepped through the grand entrance of the O'Neill estate. She clutched a modest gift wrapped in gold paper, the edges a little crinkled from the bus ride she had taken just to be here. Clara knew she didn't look like the other guests. She didn't wear designer labels or flash diamond necklaces, but she had something far rarer: loyalty, kindness, and a history with Danielle that not even the sharpest suits could counterfeit. The guards hesitated for a moment when she arrived, their eyes flickering across her outfit and worn shoes, but a quick check of the guest list allowed her entrance. Still, that slight pause planted a seed of discomfort in Clara's chest, a reminder that even invitations couldn't always erase the walls people built. As Clara moved deeper into the celebration, the difference between her and the others sharpened like a blade. Elegant ladies in pastel gowns shifted slightly as she passed, their smiles tight, their conversations pausing just long enough for the message to be clear. She didn't belong. Men with polished shoes and careful grins glanced at her, some with thin curiosity, others with outright disdain masked under polite nods. Clara straightened her back and reminded herself why she was here. For Danielle. Always for Danielle. They had met years ago at a community outreach program, when Danielle was still a fiery teenager determined to make a difference, and Clara was a volunteer tutor fresh out of college, fueled by dreams bigger than her bank account. Over late-night coffees, shared tears, and countless battles with bureaucracy, a bond had been forged, one built not on wealth or status, but on fierce, unconditional support. When Danielle had risen higher and higher into society, she never forgot Clara. But today, Clara realized, not everyone felt as generous. The reception buzzed around her like a hive, but Clara felt adrift. She wove her way toward the gift table, placing her modest present among the sea of oversized, gleaming packages. The contrast was painful, like a patch of gray against a field of gold. A woman nearby, draped in a gown that shimmered like molten silver, whispered something to her companion, both of them laughing lightly in that way that didn't need words to wound. Shaquille, towering near the edge of the tent, caught the movement from the corner of his eye. His instincts, honed over years of watching the quiet cruelties of privilege, flared to life. He didn't move immediately. He didn't want to draw attention, but he locked Clara's position in his mind. She was one of the good ones, the real ones, and he had no intention of letting her stand alone if it came to that. At her table, Clara unfolded her napkin carefully and smoothed it across her lap, pretending not to notice how the couple beside her slid their chairs a few inches away. She smiled at the waiter who poured her water, a small, grateful expression that felt like an act of defiance amid the brittle smiles and clinking glasses. Around her, conversation swirled. Country club mergers, vacation homes in Aspen, whispered political opinions tossed like currency. Clara tried to join in once, mentioning a new literacy program she was helping to run downtown, but her words landed like stones in a well met with polite nods, then immediate chilly pivots to safer, shinier topics. The undercurrent of classism was strong, but what stung more was the thin, almost imperceptible thread of racism woven through it. Clara, with her warm brown skin and soft curls pinned in an elegant bun, stood out in ways money couldn't mask. Some guests hid it better than others, but it was there in the sidelong glances, in the way conversations dulled when she approached, in the endless tiny ways people chose to exclude without ever saying a cruel word out loud. The final cut came when Clara, standing in line for the buffet, overheard two women speaking just a little too loudly behind her. Who invited her? She's sweet, but honestly, it's not a charity event, one said with a laugh that prickled at Clara's spine. Clara turned away, her cheeks burning. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here because Danielle had asked her to be, and yet no amount of loyalty could shield her from the sharp edge of humiliation. She balanced her plate carefully, found a corner seat, and let the noise of the celebration wash over her like a tide she could not reach. Shaq, from his vantage point near the bar, watched it all unfold. He clenched his jaw, feeling the urge to step in, to sweep the nonsense away with a few carefully chosen words. But he knew better. Timing was everything. Drawing attention now would only make things worse for Clara, painting her as a problem instead of allowing her dignity to speak for itself. Instead, he bided his time, keeping her under his silent protection. His mind raced, remembering all the times he'd faced the same kind of subtle blades, when his size, his color, his very presence had been judged before he ever opened his mouth. It had taught him patience. It had taught him strength, and today it taught him restraint. Back at the head table, Danielle was radiant, oblivious for now to the undercurrents swirling through her perfect day. Her laughter was the music Clara clung to as she sat, smiling thinly, sipping water she could barely taste. The wedding planner announced the next round of toasts, and the crowd shifted their attention to the front. Clara took the opportunity to slip outside for a breath of fresh air, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to cry. Not here, not where it would only confirm everything they already thought about her. Behind her, whispers followed like shadows, too soft to catch, but heavy enough to feel. As she passed by the marble fountain, a small boy no older than 5 ran up to her, clutching a crumpled flower crown made of dandelions. He offered it to her with a gap-toothed grin. "For you, pretty lady," he said. The simple, innocent kindness broke the dam inside Clara. She knelt, accepting the crown with trembling hands, blinking back tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with resilience. Inside the tent, Regina Whitmore, the queen bee of Atlanta's old money elite, watched the interaction with thinly veiled disdain. She sipped her champagne and exchanged a knowing look with her husband. Clara James was not part of their world, and in Regina's mind, today was no place for charity cases or misfits. She leaned in close to her circle, a whisper forming on her lips that would set events into motion far crueler than Clara could imagine. And in the shadows, Shaq's patience thinned to a razor's edge. He knew something was about to break, and he vowed silently that when it did, he would be ready. The ceremony unfolded like a delicate symphony under the open sky, each note carefully placed, each moment hovering on the edge of perfect. Danielle stood beneath the arch of woven roses, her hand nestled securely in Charles's broad grasp, and for a while the world seemed to hold its breath in admiration. The minister's words floated through the afternoon air, a cadence of promises and prayers meant to stitch 2 lives together forever. Yet even in this hallowed moment, an undercurrent of something sour rippled beneath the surface, invisible to most, but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. Clara sat near the middle rows, her modest dress blending in only because she made herself small, invisible if she could. She kept her eyes fixed on Danielle, offering her unwavering support from a distance, but around her the tiny knives of whispered judgment flew fast and sharp. She could hear the barely muffled snickers when her old shoes scuffed the grass, could feel the burning glances grazing her like nettles. Words, hissed behind manicured hands, sliced through the otherwise perfect tableau. "Must have wandered in from the street," someone murmured behind her, followed by the delicate clink of laughter masked under the clearing of throats. Another voice, sugar-coated but laced with venom, whispered, "Bless her heart. Danielle's always been so inclusive." Clara stiffened, her fingers tightening around the clutch in her lap. She refused to look back. She refused to let them see that the words had found their mark. From his place at the edge of the crowd, Shaq noticed the change. He had trained his whole life to read the atmosphere in a room, to sense when a threat wasn't loud, but creeping. His eyes scanned the faces, catching the two slick smiles, the glances that darted like knives before sliding away under the weight of his gaze. He could see Clara folding in on herself slightly, her chin dropping just a fraction, her shoulders curving inward in silent defense. He felt the heat rise up his neck, a slow, heavy burn that demanded action. But he forced himself to wait. This was Danielle's moment, a once-in-a-lifetime kind of happiness, and Shaq knew from experience how fragile it could be. One wrong move, one burst of anger, and the entire day could unravel. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself. His time to act would come. Not yet. Not here. Regina Whitmore watched it all unfold, from her seat near the front, a vision of icy elegance in a high-collared navy gown, and pearls that gleamed under the sun. Her smile was small, satisfied. She leaned toward her husband, murmuring something that made his lips twitch in a smirk. To Regina, Clara James was an eyesore, a blemish on the otherwise flawless landscape she expected at events like this. And Regina, as always, believed it her civic duty to maintain the illusion of perfection at all costs. The seeds of conflict were not just being sown, they were already sprouting in the looks, the whispers, the delicate exclusions executed with surgical precision. And Clara, without armor or backup, stood in the center of it, enduring with a grace that only made the attacks sting sharper. The ceremony moved into the exchange of vows, and the crowd leaned forward, swept up in the sincerity radiating from Danielle and Charles. Their voices, clear and trembling with emotion, pulled smiles and tears from the rows of guests. For a few brief minutes, the poison in the air receded, overwhelmed by the raw power of love spoken out loud. But it was only a temporary reprieve. As the newlyweds turned to face the guests, arms raised in triumph, the applause exploded into the bright air. People rose to their feet, clapping, whistling, cheering. Even Clara stood, letting herself bask in the light of her friend's joy. She caught Danielle's eye for the briefest of seconds, and in that glance was a message stronger than any vow. I see you. I'm glad you're here. It was enough to steady Clara's heart, even as the undercurrents continued to swirl. Following the ceremony, the crowd began to drift toward the reception area, a sprawling arrangement of tables under massive white tents strung with fairy lights that would soon glow against the deepening sky. Caterers in crisp uniforms moved among the guests, offering champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvre. Conversations sparked to life again, lively and loud, but the underbelly of exclusion remained, coiling itself tighter around Clara's every step. Shaq hung back near one of the massive oak trees, watching, weighing. He knew how this game worked. The predators wore silk and smiled with their teeth hidden behind charm. The prey were those who came without armor, made of status or money. And while Clara might not know all the rules of this world, Shaq knew them all too well. At a nearby table, Regina circled like a shark sensing blood. She smiled graciously at a few guests, exchanging quick gossip about the ceremony's flower choices, before setting her sights on Clara, who stood momentarily alone by the drink station. Regina's eyes gleamed with a quiet cruelty that made Shaq's stomach twist. Shaq pressed his tongue against the inside of his cheek, a habit he had when fighting the urge to storm in and set things right. His heart hammered, his instincts screamed, but he stayed still, anchored by his respect for Danielle's dream of a perfect day. The whispers grew bolder now, as drinks loosened tongues and the sun dipped lower, lengthening the shadows. Regina gathered a small clutch of similarly privileged guests, and with the precision of a seasoned performer, began weaving a narrative about Clara's supposed motives for attending. A narrative dripping with insinuation and contempt. She didn't say anything explicitly cruel. She didn't have to. Her tone, her carefully arched eyebrow, her knowing smile did all the work. Clara stood just within earshot, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded primly before her. She heard it all, and yet she didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't run. Shaq saw that too, and in that moment, his admiration for Clara deepened into something fierce and immovable. Regina thought she was clever, thought she could wound and dismiss with impunity. What she didn't realize was that in trying to humiliate Clara James, she had planted the first stone of her own downfall. Shaq tucked his hands into his pockets, the ghost of a grim smile brushing his lips. The battle had begun, and before the night was over, truth would tear through every polished lie in this place, like sunlight through a storm cloud. The reception tent glowed under 1,000 tiny lights, the sunset outside fading into a violet hush. Laughter rose and fell like music. Champagne flowed endlessly, and plates of delicacies passed from hand to hand. At the head table, Danielle beamed beside Charles, her happiness lighting the space brighter than any chandelier. It was the kind of evening crafted to be unforgettable, a seamless tapestry of elegance, warmth, and celebration. As the last course was cleared, a soft chime rang out, and the crowd hushed instinctively. The master of ceremonies, a slick-talking radio host with a golden smile, took the microphone and invited the guests to share toasts. A few family members spoke first, their voices thick with emotion, drawing laughter and tears in equal measure. Shaq clapped warmly at each speech, his massive hands offering applause that echoed warmly through the space. Then, as if on cue, Regina Whitmore rose gracefully from her seat. Clutching a crystal flute of champagne, she smiled a smile, sharpened to a razor's edge. Her gown shimmered like moonlight. As she stepped into the center, commanding the attention of every eye in the room, Shaq leaned back slightly, his senses sharpening. He knew that look. He had seen that particular brand of smile too many times before in boardrooms, at galas, at fundraisers. It was the look of someone about to draw blood, without ever raising their voice. Regina's voice floated through the air, sugary sweet, and precise. "What a magnificent day," she began, her tone syrupy, almost maternal. "And what a shining testament to the idea that true love knows no bounds, not class, not background, not circumstance." There was a slight hesitation on the last word, just long enough for it to sting. A ripple of uncertain laughter bubbled among the guests. Danielle smiled politely, oblivious. Clara, from her seat near the back, felt a prickle crawl up the back of her neck. Regina raised her glass higher, twirling the stem delicately between her fingers. "It reminds me," she continued, her eyes sweeping casually across the room before landing, too precisely on Clara, "that sometimes kindness means opening our hearts to everyone, even those who don't quite belong." The room stilled. The pause was deafening. Clara froze, her face a carefully neutral mask even as her chest tightened. Around her, guests exchanged looks, some trying to suppress smirks, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Shaq's hands curled slowly into fists under the tablecloth. Regina's smile never faltered. She took a dainty sip of champagne, as if she hadn't just gutted someone with a sentence dressed up as praise. She turned back to Danielle, her voice bright and brittle. "And darling Danielle, always so gracious. It's truly touching how you've maintained your generous spirit through all your success." The glass in Shaq's hand creaked under the pressure of his grip, but he forced himself to relax, to breathe. Rage wouldn't serve anyone right now. Not Clara, and certainly not Danielle. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Pick your moment, son. Make it count." Across the room, a few uncomfortable guests chuckled uncertainly, as if unsure whether they were meant to laugh or simply stay silent. The ugliness of it slithered through the tent, unseen by some, glaringly obvious to others. Clara, sitting still as stone, let the words wash over her. Her shoulders stayed square, her chin lifted. She met Regina's gaze once, briefly, and in that second, she wasn't small, she wasn't embarrassed. She was a woman refusing to be crushed by someone else's poison. Danielle, sensing some odd tension but not fully grasping its cause, clapped lightly along with a few scattered others, as Regina sat down. The toasts moved on, but the atmosphere had shifted. The glittering perfection of the evening had cracked, a spiderweb fracture only the most sensitive could see. Gasps had rippled in those seconds after Regina's veiled assault, and though the sound had been quickly swallowed by forced laughter, the damage lingered. Shaq leaned forward slightly, watching Clara with a slow-burning respect that pushed the earlier rage deeper inside, forging it into something colder, more deliberate. He caught her eye across the crowded tent and offered the slightest nod, not flashy, not obvious, just enough to say, "I saw, I understand." Clara returned it with the smallest of smiles, not of defeat, but of resilience. They were bound in that moment by an unspoken truth. Cruelty disguised as class was still cruelty, and they weren't going to let it win. The next few speakers tried to reclaim the mood, offering funny anecdotes and heartfelt wishes for the couple. But the energy had changed. Laughter was a little too loud, smiles a little too forced. A few guests stole glances toward Clara, their faces betraying flickers of shame or sympathy, or worse, silent agreement with Regina's poisonous implication. Shaq's heart hammered steadily beneath his suit. He could hear every beat like a drum. Not yet. He would not disrupt Danielle's dream. Not yet. But his mind was already moving, turning over possibilities, considering the right way to burn down a lie without scorching the truth. It threatened to bury. At her table, Regina whispered something to her husband, her laugh light and careless. She believed she had won. She believed she had reasserted the old rules. Money dictated belonging, and anyone who thought otherwise deserved humiliation. What she didn't understand, what she would soon learn, was that she had miscalculated badly, because Clara James wasn't alone. And Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a passive observer. He was a storm waiting for the right moment to break. Shaq sat at the corner of the reception tent, the laughter and music crashing around him like distant waves he no longer felt connected to. In the glittering whirl of champagne flutes and white tablecloths, he seemed carved from a different world, a mountain of stillness amid the swirling crowd. His eyes remained fixed on Clara, who carried herself with grace, despite the invisible cuts. Regina's words had carved deep into her. Every fiber of him burned to stand, to speak, to lay bare the cowardice masquerading as sophistication. And yet his feet remained rooted to the floor. Protect Danielle's day. That thought pulsed through him, steady and insistent. This was her dream, stitched together from years of hope and hard work. To wreck it with a public confrontation would feel like betrayal. But what about Clara? Wasn't silence just another form of betrayal too? Shaq's chest tightened with the weight of the impossible choice. A server brushed past him, the clatter of plates snapping him out of his paralysis. His gaze drifted to Danielle, radiant in her joy, oblivious to the poison coiled just beyond her reach. A bittersweet smile touched his lips. She deserved this, the bright, uncomplicated happiness she had fought for all her life. Yet under that smile was a growing fracture, a crack threatening to split him down the middle. The music shifted to a softer tune, couples rising to sway gently under the twinkling lights. Shaq leaned back, letting the memories come. He didn't resist them. Maybe in those memories he would find the answer he needed. He was 8 again, standing outside the crumbling apartment complex, where he and his siblings had grown up. His mother, Lucille, stood by the battered car, her arms laden with bags of groceries she had bought with the tips from 2 waitressing shifts back to back. Her face was tired but determined, her shoulders squared against the world's indifference. Shaq remembered how the neighbors would sometimes look at them, pitying, dismissive, sometimes cruel, and how Lucille had taught them to meet those stares with dignity, never rage. "You ain't small unless you act small," she would say, wiping sweat from her brow as she unlocked the door with weary hands. "They can look down all they want, but you never let him pull you down to where they are." Shaq closed his eyes now, feeling the echo of her voice deep in his bones. Lucille had never needed to shout to be heard. Her strength was the kind that built empires without ever lifting a sword. And sitting there in a tent filled with people who measured worth by wealth and appearances, Shaq realized he wasn't torn between 2 choices. He was facing the same choice Lucille had faced 1,000 times. Do the right thing, even when nobody else would. Sweat beaded at the back of his neck, despite the evening breeze. His heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm, hammering against his ribs. Every second that ticked by stretched thinner and thinner, pulling at the seams of his restraint. The dance floor filled quickly. Charles twirled Danielle under the fairy lights, her laughter floating up like a songbird set free. Guests clapped along, lost in the rhythm. Clara remained seated, an island apart from the tide of celebration, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She smiled politely at the few people who approached her table, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Shaq watched her and felt an ache deep enough to hollow him out. It wasn't just that Clara had been wronged. It was that nobody else had noticed, or worse, that some had noticed and simply accepted it as the cost of belonging. His fingers drummed against his thigh, a slow, dangerous beat. Not yet. Timing mattered. His mother had taught him that too. Storms were inevitable, but a wise man picked when and where to unleash them. Across the tent, Regina Whitmore perched like royalty among her entourage, her laughter chiming too loudly, her champagne flute raised in casual triumph. She thought she had won, thought she had reminded everyone of the old rules, who mattered, and who did. Shaq leaned forward, elbows braced against his knees, and studied her with a calculating calm that masked the fire rising inside him. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about truth, cold, heavy, undeniable truth, and when the time came, it would fall like a hammer in the place Regina thought safest. He turned his attention back to Danielle, twirling in her wedding gown, like the little girl who used to steal his sneakers and demand piggyback rides around their tiny apartment. If she knew what was happening now, she would be furious. Danielle, for all her grace and polish, had inherited their mother's spine of steel. But Shaq wouldn't burden her. Not tonight. This battle was his. The band shifted to a slower melody. Guests paired off, couples swaying with contented smiles. Shaq rose from his chair slowly, stretching his tall frame with deliberate ease. He wove his way through the tables, greeting a few guests with nods and polite smiles, moving closer to Clara's lonely seat. She looked up as he approached, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Before she could say a word, Shaq pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. No grand gestures, no announcements, just presence. Solid, unshakable. Clara smiled, small but real this time, a flicker of gratitude passing between them like an electrical current. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "You're not alone," he said simply. Clara's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, lifting her chin in that quiet, stubborn way that spoke louder than any speech. Regina watched from her table, her smile tightening at the edges. The lines were drawn now. The burden Shaq carried didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a shield. He wasn't here to protect Danielle's illusion of a perfect day. He was here to protect the reality of what made their family strong. Dignity, loyalty, courage when it mattered most. The question wasn't if he would act. It was only a matter of when. And when he did, the truth would shatter the lies spun so carefully under this glittering tent, exposing every cracked, rotten thing hiding beneath the surface. The evening's energy began to fracture, subtle but certain, like glass under a hairline crack. The music played on, a lively backdrop to the bright chatter and swirling laughter, but Clara felt herself shrinking into the invisible spaces between conversations, the places no light seemed to reach. Her chair had become an island, and every glance, every whisper weighed heavier on her fragile dignity. It wasn't rage she carried as she stood from the table. It was resignation. The slow, heavy acceptance that no matter how kind her heart, no matter how pure her reasons, in this world kindness could be twisted into pity, and loyalty mistaken for charity. Clutching her small purse to her chest, Clara walked toward the exit with the careful grace of someone refusing to let her retreat look like defeat. The long train of Danielle's laughter still echoed across the tent, but for Clara it sounded distant, unreachable, like a melody fading down a tunnel. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Goodbyes were for equals, and tonight had made it clear that many here would never see her as such. Shaq spotted her movement instantly from across the floor. His muscles tightened instinctively, but he didn't move immediately. He watched her weave silently through the maze of round tables and floral centerpieces, her head held high, her pace steady despite the cracks only he could see forming in her composure. He waited until she slipped through the open flaps of the tent into the dying light of the garden before he rose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. Few noticed his exit. Most were too consumed with themselves, their next drink, their next staged photo beneath the twinkling canopy. Shaq walked calmly, his massive frame cutting a deliberate path through the oblivious crowd. Each step carried a quiet urgency, a restrained storm brewing under his tailored exterior. Outside, the garden was a softer world, bathed in the last golden breaths of sunset. Trees stood like silent witnesses, their long shadows reaching across the manicured lawn. Clara stood near the far fountain, her back to the tent, staring into the slow ripple of the water, as if it could answer the aching questions pressing against her chest. Shaq didn't speak. Words felt heavy, useless. Instead, he approached quietly, letting the silence fill the space between them. The only sounds were the faint hum of cicadas and the muted splash of the fountain. Clara didn't turn to look at him. She didn't have to. His presence was a wall against the cold, a shield she didn't know she needed, until she felt it. They stood there for long moments, not touching, not moving, just breathing in the thick, humid air heavy with unspoken understanding. The pain in Clara's posture was raw, the kind that didn't manifest in tears or trembling, but in the stiff set of her shoulders and the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head toward the ground. Shaq's heart broke for her in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't pity. It was fury, not wild and reckless, but deep, righteous. Fury at a system that could polish cruelty into something so subtle it almost looked like courtesy. Fury that even in spaces filled with love and joy, someone like Clara could still be made to feel so utterly alone. A vibration against his hip broke the moment. Shaq slid his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. A new message blinked across the screen. Anonymous and sharp. If you stand with her, you stand against us. He stared at the words, the weight of them slamming into his gut. There was no signature, no hint of who had sent it. But the message was clear enough. A warning, a threat wrapped in silk, delivered by someone who believed power was eternal and unchallengeable. Someone inside the tent, someone who had watched him walk after Clara and decided it made him an enemy. He looked up slowly, his gaze sweeping across the garden, half expecting to catch a shadow slipping away. But there was nothing, only the slow sway of the trees and the last gasp of daylight bleeding into dusk. Shaq's jaw clenched. He slid the phone back into his pocket and turned his full attention back to Clara. She had wrapped her arms tightly around herself now, the act small but devastating. She didn't ask him why he was there. She didn't speak at all. In her silence was the battered knowledge that sometimes even those you loved couldn't shield you from the world's ugly truths. Shaq took a slow step forward, his dress shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't promise that everything would be okay. Instead, he simply stood beside her, their shadows merging against the marble of the fountain. Two figures carved out of the same stubborn hope that maybe, somehow, dignity could still mean something. The tent behind them exploded with new laughter as the DJ switched to an upbeat dance track. The crowd inside had moved on, blissfully unaware of the fractures that had deepened just beyond the edge of their perfect world. Shaq knew what he had to do now. He had known it the moment Clara stood to leave, the moment her spirit sagged under the weight of polished cruelty. But the text message had stripped away the last thread of hesitation. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about every unspoken slight, every masked insult, every moment of cold judgment disguised as tradition. It was about choosing sides. And Shaquille O'Neal had never been one to stand quietly when a line had to be drawn. He turned slightly, his broad shoulder brushing Clara's arm gently. It was a silent invitation, not a command. A promise that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. A small, weary motion, but filled with a stubborn kind of grace. Together they turned back toward the tent, the soft glow of the fairy lights illuminating their path. Shaq could feel the tension ahead, the invisible wall that would try to stop them. He could almost hear the whispers sharpening into knives, the brittle smiles ready to crack. Good. Let them sharpen their words. Let them draw their lines. Shaq was ready to cross every single one of them. And before the night was done, the truth hiding behind all that polished perfection would be dragged into the light, whether they liked it or not. The garden stretched out before them in gentle waves of green, the last threads of daylight pulling shadows long across the lawn. Shaq led Clara toward the far end of the property where the oldest magnolia tree stood, its massive trunk gnarled and sturdy, branches twisting high above like the arms of a silent sentinel. Beneath it, the air smelled sweeter, heavier with the scent of blooming flowers, as if nature itself had tucked this place away for secrets to be spoken. Clara sank onto the curved stone bench nestled into the roots, her shoulders sagging under the invisible weight she had carried all evening. Shaq remained standing for a moment, his broad frame casting a wide shadow across her, a shield against the distant buzz of the party behind them. When he finally sat beside her, the stone groaned quietly under his weight, but neither of them laughed. The mood had shifted beyond such simple comfort. They sat in silence at first, the kind that spoke volumes. The cicadas sang somewhere in the distance, a slow droning hum that filled the empty spaces between their breaths. Clara wrung her hands in her lap, staring down at her fingers, as if she could will herself into saying the right thing. Shaq waited, his patience deep and steady, the way only a man who had carried generations of struggle inside him could. Finally Clara spoke, her voice so low it almost disappeared into the warm night. "I didn't come here tonight just to celebrate Danielle," she said, her words brittle but deliberate. "I came because there's something people need to know. Something about Regina." Shaq's brow furrowed slightly, but he stayed silent, letting her find her pace. Clara took a shaky breath and continued. "You know the Whitmore Foundation, right? The big charity Regina chairs? The one that helps underprivileged kids?" Shaq nodded slowly, a sour taste rising in his mouth. He had seen the glossy fundraisers, the photo ops with smiling children, the sparkling galas that made the city's elite feel magnanimous for a night. He had always felt something off about it, but had chalked it up to the usual ego wrapped in charity. "It's a scam," Clara said, her voice hardening. "Not the whole thing, just enough to line Regina's pockets. They stage these big fundraising events, pull in 6, sometimes 7 figures in donations, but only a fraction of it ever actually reaches the programs it's supposed to support." Shaq's jaw tightened. He turned slightly to face her, the full weight of his attention now bearing down. Clara pulled a small, worn envelope from her purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it to him. Shaq took it carefully, as if it might break apart in his hands. Inside were photocopies, receipts, emails, spreadsheets, hard proof, line after line of misappropriated funds, inflated invoices, shell companies tied back to Regina, under different names. A paper trail leading straight to the woman who had just humiliated Clara, under the glow of 1,000 fairy lights. Shaq's stomach twisted as he scanned the papers. Each number, each transaction, felt like a punch to the gut. He had grown up on the promises of better futures built on charity, on education, on opportunity. To see someone twist that into a weapon for personal gain was a betrayal that cut deeper than any insult. "How long have you known?" Shaq asked, his voice low and steady. Clara hugged herself, as if trying to hold her ribs together. "Months. I volunteer at one of the literacy centers they sponsor. I started noticing the supplies weren't coming in, the programs getting cut without explanation. I dug around, found discrepancies, and when I tried to raise concerns, I got pushed out. Quietly, they made it seem like I chose to leave, like I wasn't grateful enough." The pain in her voice was sharp, but there was something else too. Steel. Clara might have been bruised tonight, but she wasn't broken. Shaq leaned back against the bench, the magnolia's heavy blooms brushing against his shoulder. He stared up into the tangled branches, thinking, the easy thing would be to stay silent. Pretend he hadn't seen the papers. Let the rich and powerful protect their own. After all, what would exposing Regina really do? It wouldn't fix the bruises Clara carried. It wouldn't restore what had been stolen from countless kids who never even knew their chances had been robbed at a gala, under sparkling chandeliers. But Shaq wasn't built for easy. "You were gonna do this alone?" he asked quietly, not needing to hear the answer. Clara smiled sadly. "I thought maybe tonight, if the right people were here, if I could find the right moment." She trailed off, the hopelessness threading through her words like smoke. "But after what happened, after what Regina did in front of everyone, who would believe me now?" Shaq looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had stood tall when the world bent low, who had borne humiliation without lashing out, who had carried the truth alone because no one else had dared to. "I believe you," he said simply. Clara's breath hitched, a sound half sob, half laugh, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to keep it from spilling out. The garden seemed to lean in closer, the magnolia tree creaking softly above them, like an ancient judge passing silent judgment. Shaq folded the papers neatly and tucked them into his jacket. The choice was clear now. Regina Whitmore didn't just need to be exposed. She needed to be exposed here, tonight, in front of all the polished smiles that had shielded her for too long. But not through anger, not through spectacle, through truth. Undeniable. Unbreakable. He rose from the bench, offering Clara his hand. She hesitated for only a second before placing her smaller hand in his, letting him pull her gently to her feet. Together, they turned back toward the distant glow of the tent, where the dance floor pulsed and laughter spilled into the night like champagne overflowing a glass. Shaq could feel the storm building inside him, but it was no longer wild or reckless. It was focused, sharp as a blade, honed by generations of quiet resilience. His mother's voice echoed in his head again, steady and strong. "Do it with dignity. Do it so they can't look away." He squeezed Clara's hand once, reassuring. Then together they walked back toward the battlefield, ready to bring every hidden truth into the unforgiving light. And this time, there would be no more whispers, only the sound of glass kingdoms shattering. The night inside the tent roared louder than before, the energy reaching a fever pitch fueled by endless champagne and the euphoria of a day too perfect to question. Guests spun on the dance floor in dizzy circles, heels clicked on the polished wood, and laughter peeled out into the humid Georgia air. The fairy lights overhead blurred into soft halos of gold. As Shaq stood at the edge of it all, the envelope of evidence pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. His eyes found Danielle in the crowd. She was radiant, spinning in her gown under the dazzling lights, her face aglow with a happiness she had fought so hard to claim. Charles lifted her into the air briefly, drawing cheers from the crowd, and Shaq's throat tightened at the purity of it. His baby sister, the stubborn, fearless girl who used to tape trophies she made out of cardboard to the wall because she believed she could win anything, was living the dream she had built with her own hands, and he was about to shatter it. The weight of it staggered him. Exposing Regina meant pulling the mask off, not just one person but an entire room full of guests who had quietly played along. It would mean shattering illusions, puncturing the fragile bubble of bliss Danielle had spun around this day. The O'Neill family name would be dragged into the whispers and stares. Headlines might follow, and Danielle's wedding, the memory she had hoped to carry like a shield into her new life, would forever be stained by scandal. He could stay silent, tuck the envelope away, tell himself it wasn't his fight, that Clara could find another way, another time, another place, that today belonged to his sister, not to justice. It would be so easy to look the other way, and so much harder to live with afterward. Shaq clenched his jaw, feeling the tension grind down into the marrow of his bones. Every instinct in him, every hard-learned lesson from growing up under the watchful eyes of people waiting for him to fail, screamed against betrayal. Justice wasn't just something you preached when the cameras were on. It was something you lived when no one was watching. And right now, the whole world was too busy dancing to see the crossroads he stood at. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing the phone that had delivered the anonymous threat. "If you stand with her, you stand against us." A clear message from the powers cloaked in silk and champagne. It would be so easy to retreat, to let them win again under the disguise of good manners and silent injustice. But his mother's voice rose from somewhere deep inside him, fierce and certain. "You don't build a life on silence. You build it on truth, no matter the cost." He looked again at Clara, standing by herself near the exit of the tent, her face lit only by the spill of light from the open flaps. She didn't plead. She didn't even look at him. She stood there like a question he couldn't refuse to answer. "What kind of man are you?" The air seemed heavier now, thick with expectation. Shaq's heart pounded not with fear, but with the bone-deep certainty that this choice would define him far beyond tonight. It wasn't just about Clara. It wasn't just about Regina. It was about every slight he'd swallowed in locker rooms and boardrooms. Every time someone smiled in his face and sneered behind his back. It was about standing up when it mattered, even when it cost everything. He thought about Danielle, about the way she used to fall asleep against his shoulder, on long bus rides home, trusting him without question. What would she think of him if she knew he had seen the truth and turned away? What would he think of himself when the music stopped and the party faded into memory? Shaq exhaled slowly, a breath that carried the weight of decades. His choice wasn't between saving the night and ruining it. It was between protecting a lie and honoring everything that had brought him, and his family, to this moment. The floor beneath him seemed to steady as he made up his mind. He moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through fog, slow but unstoppable. Conversations dipped around him, some guests pausing mid-sentence as they caught the shift in his posture, the purpose in his stride. He crossed the distance to the center of the tent, where the microphone still rested on its stand, abandoned by the last tipsy speaker. He reached for it. A hand brushed his arm. Danielle, breathless and laughing, grabbing him for a dance, her happiness radiated off her like sunlight. For a moment, the world narrowed to her shining face, and the love that had never wavered between them. "You gonna dance with me, big bro?" she teased, tugging at his sleeve. Shaq smiled, a deep, aching thing full of memories too large for words. He cupped her cheek briefly, the rough pad of his thumb brushing a smudge of lipstick from her skin. "I love you, Danny," he said, his voice low but steady. Confused by the gravity in his tone, Danielle's smile faltered just slightly. But before she could ask, Shaq turned away, stepping up to the microphone, gripping it in one massive hand. The music faded awkwardly, as the band leader caught the sudden shift and motioned for quiet. Conversations stuttered into silence, heads turned, curious and expectant. Shaq stood alone at the center, the lights from the chandelier catching the sharp lines of his face. He could feel the pulse of the night slowing, the collective breath being drawn in anticipation. For a moment he just stood there, the envelope tucked against his side like a secret. He could still turn back, still smile and wave it off, still still let the lie survive one more night. Instead, he lifted his head, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "I wasn't planning on speaking tonight," he began, his tone even, almost casual. "But sometimes there's something bigger than plans. Bigger than appearances." A ripple of unease shifted through the crowd. Regina Whitmore's smile froze, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips. Shaq paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room settle onto him. He thought of Clara's quiet dignity, of his mother's unwavering strength, of every time he had been told to know his place, and every time he had refused. He drew in a steady breath, and he began to tell the truth. The silence that wrapped the reception tent was dense, almost suffocating. As Shaq stood at the microphone, the envelope gripped firmly in his hand. Guests froze mid-conversation, their bodies half turned toward him, curiosity flickering into unease, as they sensed the tone shift without quite knowing why. The band leader lowered his baton, the bartenders paused mid-pour. Even the children playing near the edge of the garden sensed the tension and grew still. Shaq's voice rolled through the space, low and steady, each word deliberate. "I'm proud to be standing here today," he began, his eyes sweeping the room, not lingering on any one person but somehow reaching every soul. "Proud of my sister, proud of my family, proud of the journey it took to get here." A polite wave of claps rose and faded quickly, the room hanging on what came next. "But pride," he continued, "isn't just about the good moments. It's about standing up when something wrong is happening, even if it's inconvenient, even if it hurts." Murmurs rippled through the tent. The guests leaned in slightly, drawn by the gravity threading through his calmness. Shaq held up the envelope, tapping it once against the microphone stand. "Tonight, I learned something about one of our guests. Something that can't be ignored." Regina Whitmore shifted in her seat, her smile faltering just enough for those nearby to notice. Her husband stiffened beside her, his hand tightening around his glass. A few others exchanged nervous glances, their eyes darting between Shaq and Regina, as realization began to dawn. Shaq unfolded the documents carefully, as if giving reverence to the truth itself. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "The Whitmore Foundation," he said, "an organization many of you have generously supported, has been misusing funds. Money meant for children's education, medical supplies, food programs, siphoned into private accounts." A sharp intake of breath cut across the tent. Plates clattered as one guest dropped a fork onto fine china. The spell of the night cracked visibly, like thin ice under too much weight. Shaq continued, his words slicing clean and cold. "The receipts are here, the wire transfers, the shell corporations, all pointing back to Regina Whitmore." Gasps echoed against the silk-draped ceiling. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Shaq stayed steady, his face carved from stone. He wasn't here for spectacle. He was here for truth. He turned his gaze directly onto Regina then, not with fury but with a slow, crushing disappointment that felt heavier than any shout could have. "You smiled in our faces," he said, the hurt cutting through his calm tone. "You used our goodwill to build your empire. You wore charity like a crown, while stealing from those who needed it most." Regina rose unsteadily to her feet, color draining from her face. Her mouth opened once, twice, but no words came out. Around her, the table guests shifted away slightly, as if afraid the truth might stain their clothes. "I won't let this day be remembered for lies," Shaq said, stepping away from the microphone, holding the evidence high for all to see. "Not for my sister, not for the kids who deserved better, and not for the people who came here believing in something good." There was no applause, just a heavy, crushing silence as the crowd struggled to process the unmasking of one of their own. Then, one by one, the fractures became visible. A few guests rose from their seats, faces tight with anger, not at Shaq, but at the truth he had forced them to confront. They walked out briskly, heels stabbing the ground, heads held stiffly high. Some whispered frantically, others simply stared, faces pale and drawn under the golden lights. Shaq watched them go without a flicker of regret. He turned his attention back to Danielle, who stood frozen a few feet away, her bouquet clutched limply in her hands. Her face was a portrait of heartbreak, confusion, and deep, aching betrayal. For a moment it gutted Shaq more deeply than any blow he had ever taken on the court. He took a step toward her, his hands open, empty of anything but the rawness of his intention. "I'm sorry, Danny," he said, his voice thick. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you dreamed about today being perfect." Danielle blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that shimmered dangerously on the edge of her lashes. But I couldn't, Shaq continued. I couldn't let you build your new life on top of someone else's pain. That ain't who we are. That ain't what Mom taught us. Her lip trembled, and for a moment, Shaq feared she would turn away, would refuse the messy truth he had laid bare. But then, slowly, something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition, a painful but real understanding, that went deeper than the beautiful lie that had been shattered. She set down the bouquet carefully on a nearby table and walked toward him. The crowd held its breath. Danielle reached up and laid her hand against Shaq's chest, right over the spot where his heart hammered painfully against his ribs. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper only he could hear. You did the right thing. Shaq closed his eyes briefly, the weight of it hitting him all over again. He nodded once, swallowing hard against the lump rising in his throat. Around them, the party dissolved into smaller, quieter pockets. Some guests stayed, their faces open with something like gratitude. Others left, stiff-backed and bitter. But it no longer mattered. The truth had been spoken into the air, impossible to take back. Regina, flanked by a handful of remaining loyalists, retreated toward the parking lot without a word. Her empire of illusions lay crumbling behind her, the glittering mask shattered beyond repair. Shaq stood with Danielle in the center of the wreckage, their bond stronger than before, forged not by perfection, but by the hard, painful grace of honesty. Above them, the magnolia tree swayed gently in the night breeze. And somewhere deep inside, Shaq knew they would weather whatever storms came next. Because they had chosen truth. And truth, once spoken, could never be silenced again. The night had thinned to a soft hush as the guests who remained wandered back toward their tables, murmuring in lowered voices, their elegant postures bent slightly under the invisible weight of truth. The perfect facade of the evening lay in fragments, but there was something pure and honest rising from its ruins. Something that no amount of money or influence could counterfeit. Shaq stood quietly to the side, his broad frame silhouetted against the golden lights, a silent guardian of the new, fragile honesty that had taken root. He wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't seeking applause. He simply stood, steady and unmoving, a mountain that had weathered the storm with dignity intact. Danielle wiped at her eyes, smudging the corner of her makeup, but she didn't care. She crossed the space between her and Clara, with slow, deliberate steps, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. Clara stood still, unsure, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. The distance between them felt wider than the garden, heavier than all the words that had been spoken tonight. When Danielle finally stopped in front of her, the two women looked at each other for a long, aching moment. "I'm sorry," Danielle said, her voice raw, no rehearsed lines, no polished grace, just two words that carried the full burden of everything unsaid. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." Clara shook her head, blinking fast. "You had so much to think about. You couldn't have known." "I should have known," Danielle insisted, her voice cracking. "You're my friend. You were always there for me when nobody else was." A soft, broken laugh escaped Clara's lips. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. "You don't owe me anything, Danielle." But Danielle reached forward, taking Clara's hand in both of hers, grounding them in a connection that had weathered betrayal and misunderstanding. "I owe you everything," she said, squeezing gently, "and I won't forget it again." Around them, the crowd watched, some openly, some from the corners of their eyes. There was no microphone broadcasting their words, no cameras catching the moment, but the authenticity of it rippled through the tent more powerfully than any staged apology ever could. Shaq, watching from a few steps away, felt something unclench inside his chest. This was what mattered. Not the glittering lights, not the designer gowns, not the whispered approval of strangers. It was loyalty. It was truth. It was the quiet kind of love that didn't wilt under scrutiny. The band, unsure whether to start again or remain silent, strummed a few uncertain notes. The guests shuffled, torn between leaving and staying, uncertain how to react now that the rules of the evening had been rewritten. It was then that a new voice spoke up, clear and unwavering. "If I may," Clara said, her voice soft but carrying easily over the hushed tent. The attention shifted back to her, curiosity sparking in eyes that had once dismissed her. "There's something you should all know," Clara continued, her shoulders straightening. "I'm not just a volunteer at the Literacy Center." She paused, letting the words hang there, waiting for the weight of them to settle. I'm a trustee of the Carter James Foundation, she said, one of the largest private funds for educational programs in the southeastern United States. A collective gasp rippled through the tent. Heads snapped toward one another, whispers rising like the tide. The Carter James Foundation was legendary. A powerhouse of silent giving, responsible for scholarships, libraries, after-school programs that had lifted thousands of children out of poverty without ever seeking the spotlight. Clara smiled, small and serene, the kind of smile that needed no validation. We prefer to stay behind the scenes, she said, a soft chuckle slipping through. Real change doesn't need a red carpet. Shock painted itself across the crowd, vivid and undeniable. Those who had snickered earlier, who had whispered cruel assumptions, now stared at Clara with new, uneasy respect, and in some cases, shame. Shock allowed himself a rare, slow smile, the kind that came not from triumph, but from witnessing a truth powerful enough to knock down walls. Danielle laughed through her tears. A bright, broken sound. You sneaky, humble woman, she said, pulling Clara into a fierce hug. Clara hugged her back, the last of the night's heaviness sliding off her shoulders. Around them, something shifted among the guests. A recognition, a recalibration. No one could pretend now. No one could deny the depth and strength that had been standing among them all along, disguised only by their own blindness. Regina was nowhere to be seen. She had fled into the night, leaving behind a legacy shattered beyond repair. And in her place, the true heart of the evening revealed itself. Raw, imperfect, but breathtakingly real. The music resumed. Softer this time, a slow, soulful melody that fit the mood perfectly. Guests who had stayed found themselves moving toward the dance floor again, not to escape, but to honor the new rhythm that had taken over the night. It wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about connection. Shaq moved quietly toward the exit, content to leave the spotlight behind. But before he could slip away, Danielle caught him, grabbing his hand and pulling him back. You're not going anywhere, Big Shaq, she said, smiling through her tears. This celebration's as much yours as it is mine. He hesitated, the instinct to fade into the background warring with the warmth of belonging. Then he nodded once, letting her pull him back into the circle of family and friends. As the first rays of dawn began to creep up over the horizon, casting a golden blush across the garden, Shaq stood beneath the magnolia tree once more, looking out over the people gathered there. He saw Clara laughing with new allies, Danielle dancing barefoot on the grass, Charles clapping along with the band, and the O'Neill matriarch Lucille, smiling quietly from her seat, pride radiating from her like a crown. This was what redemption looked like. Not grand pronouncements or thunderous applause, but the slow, steady reclaiming of truth, of dignity, of hope. Shaq felt the sun warm his face and let the moment sink deep into his bones. In the end, the lies had crumbled, the masks had fallen, and what remained was stronger than anything money could buy. Love, justice, hope, all shining, pure and unstoppable, under the open sun. When giants rise, the world has no choice but to listen. Stay with us, because the real stories, the ones that change hearts and shake empires, are just getting started.